everyone. Welcome to Horror 101 with Dr. AC. My name is Aaron Christensen. It's the most fun you'll have being scared. So trumpeted the ads for George Romero's Creepshow, a live-action anthology film which echoed the pleasures found within the pages of such EC Comics titles as Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear, which predated HBO's series Tales from the Crypt and Romero's own Tales from the Darkside, which premiered the following year. Tonight, we'll be discussing this much-beloved omnibus, as well as Shout Factory's recent UHD release, and we've assembled an impressive roster to fill out tonight's panel. We have screenwriter, novelist, and musician Darren Callahan. We have playwright Dan Caffrey, also of the podcast The Losers Club. We have S.A. Bradley from Hellbent for Horror, Aaron Abishan from Discover the Horror, and his faithful co-host, John Kitley of Kitley's Crypt. And we're all here to talk about Creepshow from 1982. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
What I would love to do is kind of just start off with our initial experiences of Creepshow, because I feel like it was right in our sweet spot for most of us when we were growing up. Can I start with you, Darren?
Sure.
Where did you see and experience Creepshow for the first time?
You know, I saw it on HBO. I did read the comic book ahead of time because at the same time a small comic book version came out. So I'd actually read that prior to seeing the film. But I saw the film on HBO probably after 8 p.m. because that's when they played R-rated movies. And I was already familiar with George Romero and I was already a fan. So, yeah, it was probably somewhere. Let's say it came out in 82. I bet it was on HBO in 83. I'll have to check my HBO guides.
And I would like to think you still have them.
I do.
You have your bank of them. Scott?
Kind of like what Darren said, I think it was in Walden Books. They had the graphic novel / comic book that they put out before the movie. And I was so excited about the idea of there being Creepshow that I grabbed that ahead of time. But I was there for opening night and I could have sworn it was Halloween, but it says it was November 10th, 1982. But I could have sworn because they had this thing on their ads for the movie that if you came in a mask, you were a creep and you could get in for either half price or for free. Sweet. And so I went and I wore a mask staggering in. I'm like, I can't wait. It's going to be a friggin' party. I walk in, it's like 5 people in there and nobody else is wearing a mask. And I'm like, ooh, okay. So I took my normal upfront seat. And I think that the reputation of Creepshow built from there. But when it first came out, at least where I was in Pennsylvania, it was not something that was standing room only. People kind of got into it, I think, more when it was on HBO than in the movie theaters. And it was interesting reading the comic book. I found it scarier in the comic than I did as a film. And it's because of the energy and the tenor. That was the difference between Bernie Wrightson's drawing and Michael Gornick's photography. Dan?
So when I was 9, every Friday night, my dad would rent 2 movies that I had never seen before. And they were usually more on the grown-up side. Like I remember we did Stand By Me in the Abyss one night. It was like a really good double feature. And Creepshow was one of them. And the video store in my town was owned by my friend, and it was called Megaflix. But they purposely made the L and the I mashed together so it looked like Megafucks. So I remember like always going to Megaflix and seeing the box and seeing the creep and wanting to rent it. And yeah, my dad was kind of slowly introducing me to Stephen King at the time and just rented it, and I loved it. Although I remember as a kid being disappointed that the creep wasn't more of a host in this one. Like I thought he was going to be like the crypt keeper and talk and crack wise and everything. Although I guess in the comic he does that, and we see some of those panels in the movie of him making puns and jokes. But yeah, and I think that was probably my first piece of anthology horror that I saw. Maybe that or Cat's Eye. But Creepshow to me is like the ultimate anthology horror EC Comics throwback. So yeah, happy to be here tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Aaron?
You know, I think this is becoming a theme for me. I don't know what it is about the movies that you select and that I join you for, but it's always like, I'm not really sure where I saw this movie the first time, but it was completely baked into my reality by the time that I started to read Fangoria. And I know that I read my first Stephen King book when I was 11. That would have been 1984. So, Yeah, I don't remember the first time I saw this, but I do remember it just kind of being woven into the fabric. So I'll just lie and say I saw it on HBO because that's
Perfect.
probable. But I don't know for sure, but that seems right to me.
I would prefer it if you just lie throughout tonight's entire broadcast. That would be awesome.
You are all so handsome, I can hardly stand it.
And John,
I worked at the theater when this came out, so I don't remember how long it took me to actually go to the theater to see it in its entirety, but I had probably seen it in its entirety in segments for the at least first week before I got to go see it. I was very excited about it, and just getting to see the clips, which was nice for an anthology film because you can't spend the whole hour and a half in there, but you can get 20-minute segments pretty easy without getting in trouble. So yeah, I loved it when I first saw it, and it still remains one of my top films.
I remember seeing like the poster art was kind of scary on its own, and I was like, oh man, I did not get to see it until much later, and we didn't have HBO, so I know it was probably a renter for me, but I loved it immediately, and I think it really is one of those that lives up to its tagline of it's really fun. And I don't know if it's scary, but it's definitely, it's a horror movie, and you feel excited to be watching, basically five and a half, horror stories. This was coming off of Romero's kind of, he just had a really big hit with Dawn of the Dead. And I feel like that kind of parlayed, success for him, but he'd also just had a really big flop with Night Riders. So this was kind of an interesting place for him, and it was a make or break time for him. It's kind of amazing that he got the cast that he did.
Well, keep in mind that most of these weren't huge names at the time. Ed Harris wasn't a big name.
No, sure.
Ted Danson wasn't. This is before Cheers, I believe.
It was.
So you had E.G. Marshall, and you had
Hal Holbrook.
Hal Holbrook, Fritz Weaver, but
was it pre-Naked Gun? I mean, and not that Leslie Nielsen did
6
do other
years
stuff
prior, yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So,
but
yeah.
it was after Airplane,
Right.
so which is kind of funny because that's who I knew Leslie Nielsen from. So I knew him from his humor, and even though his character in this has a lot of humor, it's very dark, and I thought that was a really nice change of pace for him.
See, interestingly enough, I knew him from Day of the Animals.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so he's just one more asshole. So when he did Naked Gun, I was like, holy shit, this guy's funny. But anyway,
Apparently he carried a fart machine in his pocket during the production of this.
Well, fart machine is a
Yeah.
grand term for a whoopee cushion, but yes, apparently he liked to use his whoopee cushion at any and all time. But apparently that was like his shtick. Like he would go on talk shows, like he never was without it.
A toot pillow.
Hal Halbrook is our biggest name in the cast. I mean, it also has Tom Atkins, in our prologue, and it's a nice little lead in, and it introduces us to probably the least impressive of Tom Savini's effects for the entire movie, which is the Crypt Keeper. Like his little guy in the window.
Yeah, but you don't want him to look like he's a decomposed corpse or whatever, but you don't really want that right in the beginning because it sets the tone that it's not all that serious by showing him be somewhat of a Halloween scare, a lawn ornament rather than totally realistic depiction of bones and skin or whatever.
I always thought
think
it
he
looked
looks
cool as
awesome.
hell. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I thought he was fucking awesome. I mean, he wasn't animated and articulated like the comic book was, say the Bernie Wrightson look.
Right.
But I thought he was actually pretty good. I was disappointed he didn't have more time. And then, of course, you realize when you watch some of the extras on this wonderful Blu-ray that we're talking about, that you find out that they animated a lot because he was supposed to fly away and all this. And he was not created precisely the way that Savini wanted him to be created. In other words, he made the skeleton, but the costuming, I think he compared it to like a rug or a carpet or something. He was supposed to be able to be seen through. So if they had lightning, you could see that it was just ribs and things. I thought he looked really cool, but kind of like a lot of other good monsters, they don't show him a lot. And I was disappointed that I didn't see him more.
Do you guys think it's weird that because he is called the Creep, right? And like on the new Creepshow show, they have like a more advanced version of him. But then the second one, they have the creep on the poster, but then Tom Savini plays a character called the Creep who doesn't look like the Creep, and it's like it's very confusing to me. I don't know why they did it that way.
It's very meta.
Yeah, it's really deep. The second movie.
I think that moment though is one of the most important moments in the film for me. Whenever it's Joe Hill, right? It's Stephen King's son that plays Billy, and when he looks out the window, because this movie obviously is really George Romero and Stephen King's love letter to their own childhoods as comic reading, horror obsessed monster kids. And for folks who don't know the monster kid term, it's a specific term that delineates a group of baby boomers who came up in the 1950s and 60s and who were nuts about monsters. But the big thing I think was, even the monster kids always, sort of winked back at the monsters, but the monsters were still intended to be scary. And I think that when Billy looks out the window and smiles, there's sort of a baton that's being handed there, a really important one that is being handed to our generation of monster fan and our generation of horror fan. And it says, it's okay to like the thing that's scary, and that's different. It's the same as what the monster kids were doing, but there was always this sort of artifice of fear around it. And I think now it was sort of like, okay, you guys, we had fun with it. Now you guys are allowed to make it even more fun for yourselves.
Well, and I think that's what I was trying to say, inarticulately, not nearly as articulately as you just put it. The idea of, we recognize this as a horror film, but it's not necessarily scary. It's like we get to have fun watching these things unfold, and we feel like we're included in it. Like it's okay to like it. The idea of the wraparound story is you've got Tom Atkins as kind of this ball-busting father who takes his son's, trashy horror comic and throws it away and smacks him and sends him up to his room. And so Billy kind of invites in this darkness, from his friend from the comics, and I think like that's to your point, Aaron, like the monsters were our friends.
When I watched it again recently for this podcast, I thought, whose side are we on in any of these stories? Like, who are we really rooting for? Yeah, I think Hal Halbrook, you can make a case in his part, but I really think you're on the side of revenge and justice and just being, and that's emblemized by that monster. Immediately associating with him, either as a monster kid, future, past, future, present, is a good thing, because you are on the side of justice, which he's doling out in a horrible way. But yes.
Well, it's a very EC thing, right? I mean, that was always a thing of vengeance and blood in the eye of vengeance, and being as grotesque as possible. I think it's interesting. I mean, the Creep is kind of like the guy on the river Styx, right? That's what they used to say about the horror hosts as well. He's someone who is scary, but not scary. He's letting you in to these horrible things, but he's also giving you that sense of distance, right? I mean, you're in, talk about meta. You have a guy who's outside of the stories, telling you the stories, letting you see that it's a bridge, that there's actually a picture first, and then it fades into reality. So you're being softly brought into these scary stories like you were Friday night or Saturday night in your horror hosting of Creature Features or whatever you had as a kid. And I think it's very much in the vein of that. And the colors and the style of the filming jumps about every so often, but it has a certain comic book style that when I first saw it, I thought was a little arch. It's funny. I love it now. And I have this thing with Romero films. When I first see them, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's fine. And then I come back to it and I love it. And it's like his first snap of his movies, there's something that I have to get over. And with this one, it was that it wasn't as scary. I was a very, very serious horror student at the time, in my early mid-teens. And I was like, this is not scary. I've seen exploding chests. And what is he doing here? And so it took a while for me to get that energy. And then as the years have gone by, it's really become a favorite, because it is so of itself and it knows what it is. It's something that can play in the background at any Halloween party forever.
Yep.
Well, to be fair, we might get to this. I did see it at a Halloween party, and that plant one did not play.
I mean, this was their whole tribute to EC Comics. The Creep in this is the same as the Creep Keeper in the comics or the Old Witch. I mean, it's exactly from what the comics are. Because if the old Tales from the Crypt comics, the first page of that story is going to have the introduction by one of either the Crypt Keeper or the old witch or something, and then it goes into the story. Creepshow, the movie, does the exact same thing, and everybody always got what was coming to them, and I think they nailed it pretty well. The tone varies, but if you're afraid of drowning, something that tied you over is going to scare the shit out of you. If you don't like bugs, the last one is going to scare the hell out of you. And watching the Crate episode in the theater, that scared the crap out of me.
The bloom was probably off the rose that was EC Comics. I don't know how many kids, horror kids, were reading horror comics at that time. So I think, that was smart of King and Romero to kind of lay that out for us. This is a comic book movie. These are the stories, and this is how it used to be introduced. So those that were in the know, they got it. And those that were not were like, oh, that's that thing I used to hear about. Or that's, like when they came across the comics, like that's what Creepshow was doing. I feel like we really actually need to throw in our third name who makes this film a success. And that's Tom Savini. It's like we have three major masters of horror. It became heroes to that generation.
I feel like this movie is like Grindhouse, the movie, because it's like trying to introduce a generation to something they missed, because I think EC Comics stopped in 59. So it's like, hey, you need to be reminded of the aesthetic before we can really proceed. And it has to be like with Grindhouse, it has to be on almost every frame, so you can really understand what the appeal was of that technology or that time. I'm sure there's other movies that are like Grindhouse or Creepshow that are an homage to a not only just a delivery method, but horror in general. But I definitely think Grindhouse is akin to this in terms of how close it is to it.
That's a great comparison. I mean, before the days of VHS, I spent a lot of time at the public library, and that was how I came across the EC Comics. They had some compendiums of them, and I would just leaf through those. So I was familiar with it. So I think it's a great introduction, both to that style and to the idea of horror comics.
Point of clarification, I just mentioned that, Warren magazines picked up the horror comic mantle in 1962, and they were still publishing up to through 1983. So there was still such a thing as it was just a bit bigger. So that, to your points, I think that there were definitely people who needed to be introduced to it, and then there were other people who were like, oh yeah, it was like, a very familiar flavor, but brought to the big screen.
This is one of those moments where I go, you mean there's people who might not know what horror comics are?
Right.
Where I'm like going, there was a time that people, it's an interesting deal to think of that. And, we're also talking about one of the things that I think is important. We're talking about what it looks like and how it had to introduce all this stuff. It also had to do all this on a super low, not super low budget, but $8 million for its time. And I think in the first week it made $5 million of it back or something like that. So it wasn't a huge hit, but it had a great word of mouth to it. It had to introduce a lot of stuff, having 5 stories essentially in there, and had to do it with a style that may not have been known by a lot of people. I think about how well directed parts of it are, and it would be interesting to see if there was someone who wasn't our age in this that had watched it, because one of the things that I noticed rewatching it is how wonderful the tension is in 2 sequences, and that's the crate. They take forever to get that crate open. Yep. Something horrible's in there, and they have to slide it, and they're dropping. Oh, look, the nail. They do all this stuff, and you're just like going, and I wonder if kids watching are like going, we just fucking kicked the top off. What the hell are you doing?
Hitchcock, man. It's Hitchcock.
Yeah. And I loved it. And I think about like something that tied you over. It really builds. There's no weird music or anything like that. Both of these sequences are done pretty much with the suspense, and there's no soundtrack music. The soundtrack comes later. But during the most disturbing moments where not just having Ted Danson buried up to his neck, but having him have to get into the ground and having all the threats that were there, and then slowly having the water come up, was really, really rough. I mean, when I watched it, that was major suspense in the theater, and I wonder how it plays now.
In any horror movie, the moment of compliance with the bad guy is always, I think, the hardest moment to watch, because do you get in the sand pit, or do you fight now? And the answer is fight now. But You
Right.
never see that in most horror movies. By the way, just to draw another line back to Tarantino, and I don't mean to get too distracted there. I think what Tarantino and Stephen King, and even as a writer, George Romero, do so well is they follow where the story is telling them to go. So if it says, take your time with this crate opening, take your time with getting the guy in the sand pit and setting up the TV and letting you know what's happening, they'll take it. They're not following anything other than an internal clock of the story. And I really like that because a lot of writers and a lot of screenwriters particularly, they'll ignore what the story is telling them to go, either because they're getting another voice in the room or they're just not talented enough to pull it off. But the best writers for me always introduce a lot of surprise, and they also take their time with the moments of the story that really require it. Devil be damned. That's why one segment is 10 minutes and one segment is 20 minutes, because he had more of a story to tell.
On our podcast, we just read Just After Sunset, which is a short story collection by Stephen King. And something we really liked about it was how it was kind of this throwback to the more EC Comics style of writing after he had done, for lack of a better word, a lot of like prestige horror, I guess, for a long time. And I was trying to think today what would be the modern equivalent of Creepshow. I mean, you have Trick or Treat, which was over a decade old at this point, but there's not much horror anthology coming out these days, period. And I feel like the ones that do, like a lot of modern horror, like Darren was saying, they are more concerned with subversion or theme or commenting on something. And not that those aren't worthy aspirations for any kind of fiction, but I do kind of miss just like the quick and nasty hit jobs almost. That I feel like that like Creepshow still feels unique to me in that way. Like I can't, because even Trick or Treat to me feels like it's something a little bit different than Creepshow.
I like Confetti of the Mind, which is by Nacho Vigalondo, the guy who did Time Crimes.
Oh, I should watch
Yeah.
that.
It's an
Yeah.
anthology.
Write that down.
2011.
The idea of the Creepshow, in '82, I don't know that we'd had an anthology in a while, like prior to the Amicus from the early '70s.
Yeah.
So it's like it was also kind of a novelty in that regard. We had a few anthologies that came out later in the '80s, and then in terms of like modern anthologies, they're mostly kind of the VHS variety, where you have a bunch of different directors kind of all pulling together, sometimes with a common theme, sometimes with a less obvious common theme. More of a collection of short films from a bunch of different disparate voices, as opposed to a single vision written by the same person, directed by the same person, the makeup effects by the same person. Like that's the cohesiveness that I really enjoy about Creepshow.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is interesting in Creepshow, and once again, a nod to Romero as a director, is sense of place. Like he really shows that university and the janitor's area and the downstairs versus the upstairs and the hallway. So that when it starts getting subverted by a monster, you get an idea of how far away they are from help, how far away they are from anyone else that might notice. And that adds, I think, to when that crate is trying to be opened so slowly. I think the same thing is in E.G. Marshall's piece with the cockroaches, that it's a very small set, and yet you get an idea of what it's like inside of that room, even though it's all white. There are at least 2-3 rooms, and you have this weird postmodern computer. I'm not sure what the hell that thing is, but you're looking at all of this and you get a sense of direction. And I think that that's so important in setting up in horror. If you're going to have a haunted house, tell me what the house looks like.
I think one of the things that King does exceptionally well in here is the characters, because every character is well, pardon the pun, drawn out and explained. You know who the character is, you get their background, even in a very short amount of time. And I think because of the audience is going to either relate to that character, or like Leslie Nielsen, they're going to love to hate him.
Well, Dan, I don't know if you talked about this on your podcast already, but like, why is it like King is so successful here, and yet he is so not successful on multiple other attempts of and part of it is that it's an original piece. He's not adapting his work.
Yeah, two of them are the Crate?
Yeah. The
Lonesome
Crate
Death
and
Jordy Verrill.
Jordy Verrill was called Weeds.
I don't think they've ever been collected in any of his short story collections, but they were in the skin mags that he used to I think Gallery and
they're in
probably
some
Adam
other
or
anthologies,
Cavalier.
just not King's anthologies.
Yeah. And as far as why it works here, I mean, I think Romero is a big part of it, right? But there is a mixture of original material. But I don't know. I mean, I like Sleepwalkers. A lot of people hate Sleepwalkers, and that's an original one. Yeah, I know I'm getting looks already, right? I know I'm like the defender of that movie on the podcast, but he's working within a structural container that's already successful with the EC Comics thing. I mean, you guys talked about justice. That's a huge part of that, and I think with King, a lot of it is class warfare too, right? Like it's like the slobs versus the snobs kind of thing. Not every single story, but you look at a lot of them. And something to tide you over, for instance, it's like them kind of going against the rich husband. E.G. Marshall is like this rich, evil bastard. Even Jordy Verrill, who, I mean, I don't know. I guess we haven't talked about people's opinions on that. I know that's like the polarizing one, but I feel really bad for him. And it's this kind of poor bumpkin guy, the kind of people King grew up around. And I think he writes working class characters very sympathetically, and he writes them so you can relate to them. And then I think he writes rich assholes, which is, you want those extremes when you're working with.
Yeah, but
comics.
When you're in a short form, it's good to have some tropes to go to.
Yes.
But back to John's thing about characters. Are these types? And we're just hooking onto the type, Is there I feel like even within the type, mad scientist or whatever it might be, King does find some nice little things, that are unexpected within each of them. But back to Father's Day, I think that is the one where I know the people the least. Now, my main bitch about Father's Day is, who the hell mixed that thing? Have you ever listened to Father's Day on headphones or, on any decent sound system? Like, it sounds totally different. In my house here, that we have a movie theater that we can rent and use. So I watched Creepshow there, and I haven't seen it since on the big screen since, I saw it at some fest. I again was reminded that of all the things, that one is so in your face. Like all the sound mix of it, that all the screaming and the pounding and the noise, it's just like, it's like a assault of the senses that none of the other episodes seem to have.
I'm not sure about the sound system on it. I do feel that the first one is just kind of like this punch. It doesn't have as much of a layered feel as the other stories. It's like the perfect intro. Like, you wanted a monster, here comes a monster out of the ground, and the story's really quick. You have the head on a plate and everything, and it feels very, very EC in that way. Back to the thing about King. I have a theory about King, and I think one of the reasons that it works well in Creepshow is that there's a very simple idea that he's going for, and a very short form, right? These are short stories. And I think King is really hard to adapt, because a lot of times the thing that's supernatural in his story is pretty good. But the reason you get so invested in King is that you are in an internal monologue most of the time with the characters, and internal monologues don't work on movies. And so the things that you're most invested with, like in Cujo, you're in the minds of like 4 different main characters, and you are stuck with those guys. In It, there are entire chapters that are based on one person, and that's stuff that doesn't translate well to film. But this is an idea that from the very beginning he had to go, okay, short, sweet. It's like a Ramones song, in and out, no killer, all killer, no filler, let's be done. And I think that it works a lot better than trying to get to the nuances of a lot of the things that King does. If you strip away a lot of the character development from some of his big novels, the structure of the horror isn't nearly as good. It can sometimes be rather pedestrian.
My thing with Father's Day is that it feels like it just kind of comes out of nowhere. In terms of Nathan Grantham coming up out of the ground, like she spills the whiskey, and it's like, that's the inciting incident. Like, because she's been doing this year after year after year, and you never get the indication of what makes this year different. That's the one quibble I have with Father's Day.
I think it's the dancing. It's the dancing.
Yeah, Ed Harris's dance moves.
That'll do it.
He's like, this will not stand.
I will say, though, that I think that that's pretty common to the story structures of both EC and Warren comics, in that there was sort of this family drama or this sort of intrigue that would happen, and then they just sort of dump a monster on it at the end. Like, oh, there's a monster magazine, we got to throw a monster in to make it, real. And that's one of the things I think King does a really nice job of here, and I think it's sort of why the fact that we talked about the fact that it's so fun earlier, is just that there's this suspension of logic that in other people's hands would feel clunky, but it doesn't feel clunky to me here. It feels like they're luckily riding the far end of a wave that had already kind of crested, bringing forward this concept of family horror, the person next door, the family next door, the Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Obviously, those are a decade or two prior, but we had really seen horror come full circle this way. But all that stuff was there in EC and Warren Comics. It just also always sort of, like I said, just poured a monster on at some point throughout that kind of a story.
I don't know. I feel like that in all of the other episodes, there's a reason for that monster. Even in the crate where the monster's in a crate, like we understand, okay, that was from an expedition and it was stashed away. With Jordy Verrill, the reason he turns into a plant is because he touched it. I just feel like the Father's Day episode is just a little convenient in a way that the others are not. And maybe that is a callback to some other stories from EC Comics, but it felt like there was a little bit more internal logic for the most part. Like there was a cause and effect.
What's the internal logic then to something to tide you over? Is it just revenge made them see monsters?
That's right. Do you not know this?
Yeah. Spite. All ghosts come from spite.
Is it supposed to be the whiskey? Maybe she's never. Well, no, she pours it out though. She doesn't like spill it accidentally.
I think it's just that's the story. I don't think that it, other than the fact that it's Father's
John's
Day.
like, why are you talking?
Geez, that's the story. If otherwise, to Aaron's point, there's no fucking monster. Okay, that was kind of a boring story.
It would have been so easy to come up with a reason why.
It was Father's Day. Good Lord.
It's always Father's Day, though. That's my point. Is that
Not
she's
every
been
day.
doing that? Like that's all we hear about from is that they're like going, she does this every year. It's like, well, what's different this year?
Yeah, it could have been something as simple. You're right, as them getting together to read a final will. They found some kind of
Whatever,
thing.
yeah,
They're about to sell the building.
A thing,
whatever.
They found
it
the
is.
ashtray.
Yeah, they found the ashtray, which I found in all 4 or 5.
You have 5 stories. They're all going to be gradients. They never are all going to be your number one. That it is good practice to start with sort of one that has the one that has the aesthetic but doesn't have the story. That's okay. You've got everybody hooked. You can overwhelm them with the sound mix. You can splash the colors. They're not going to notice the fact that you underwrote that one. And then before they know it, they're on to the second one, which is where I think is the film has a pacing problem in the first 2, because the first 2 are bad. Now, in the theater, you can't leave, or you probably shouldn't leave if you paid your ticket. But at home, I wonder how many people got to that second one and were like, I'm out, and missed some brilliance because the third and the fourth one are so amazing. But it's really risky having 2 bummers in a row.
Do you guys dislike the second one? Because
I like the second one.
I
do
like
too.
all of them.
Yeah,
I do too.
I don't know. That's
it's
second
my
one.
least favorite, but it's probably the one that I think looks the most beautiful.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
weirdly beautiful.
For the 2 who don't like it, what is it you don't like about it?
Well, I get what they're going for in terms of the comic coyote aesthetic. And everything is within that style, the cantilevered camera and the big performance by a non-actor. And I do agree that I think the plants are a cool special effect and everything. But my whole thing around that, not only do I find it not as funny as they seem to think it is, it also is extremely tragic in a way that isn't revenge. I mean, if you're getting revenge on the poor guy for trying to monopolize or monetize a rock he found, that's really mean-spirited, around it. He really has a terrible death for no reason. And I don't know. I just don't feel like there's anything more to the story. Guy turns into the plant. There you go. You got the whole thing. Just take it. And I'm like, I really, particularly if you're going to direct it at such a 10 level, there's got to be a reason for those choices aside from we want it to move fast. People get bored because they'll notice the story is terrible.
I wonder if, because I actually haven't read Weeds, the short story. I'd be curious if the tone has that kind of comic affectation that King does, because a lot of it could be just how King's doing.
I like the story itself a little bit better, because I always saw that as, like Joss Whedon says that he made Buffy the Vampire Slayer because he took the girl who was always killed in the movies and made her the lead. And I thought that this was taking the guy from the Blob that's in the very beginning,
the first guy,
and you make the whole story about him. Yeah, instead of it being about everything else that comes.
Well, but apparently this was the first chapter in a novel, and he's like, I got nothing after this chapter.
Yeah.
He just forgot it.
for the most part, I like the idea, and I think it's sadder than we give it credit. I mean, it's really, it's Lovecraftian in that way, like Color Out of Space. You know, the idea is nobody really does anything right. Nobody does anything wrong. It's not there to be malevolent. It's just eating. And the idea that you could have an elder god land on Earth and we're just a sterile petri dish waiting to get covered by this fucking shit is a terrifying idea. And I like that. I just think sometimes tonally, I get a little bit of that West and East Coast kind of thing where everything's a flyby state. There's a little bit of condescending nature between King and Romero on that. And it always struck me as a little bit uncomfortable, not terrible, but it's just the jokiness is a little bit much for the kind of thing that you're doing. You know,
it's like he made the movie of the people that in Dawn of the Dead, the helicopter flew over the National Guardsmen. It's like, let's pick one of those dudes, put him in a cabin. Because he is very caricature around that. I know that he actually has great affinity for people from that background. And maybe that's why he chose to play it so Wile E. Coyote, because he's like, I don't want you to think this is a real farmer because they're very smart. I like big swings. It's okay. He made a big swing on that second episode.
The rest of the actors are grounded enough in their performances that it doesn't, like, I feel like, because on the commentary, Romero talks about how he did keep pushing King to go bigger and go bigger. Because it's a comic book. It's a comic book. It's like, well, everybody else seems to be able to perform in a comic book movie without being a cartoon. Romero was trying to direct him as best he could, and that was maybe King wasn't giving a grounded enough performance. He's like, okay, let's go the other way. Let's go bigger.
Twice a month in my human life, for my entire life, I have gotten something nasty on my hand and went, meteor shit. So the movie this resonated. This sequence with resonance. That's right.
Let's swing on into the third story, which you've touched on a little bit, but something to tide you over, where we have Leslie Nielsen's vengeance-seeking cuckolded husband, who's dealing with a couple that is that he feels needs to have some justice meted out. Leslie Nielsen, I think, is terrific in this. He rides that line between being cartoony and being grounded.
He's a real actor. I mean, he's very underrated because he's gotten known for his farcical performances, but I mean, his whole career, he's you know, he knows what movie he's in, which I love. You know, he'll play just to the limit of what that movie should be, whether it's Day of the Animals, whether it's this, whether it's Forbidden Planet. You know, he's like, there's no other actor I can think of off the top of my head, maybe Tom Atkins, who's like, this is the movie I'm in. I'm in Night of the Creeps.
I think that's a good way of what Nielsen does is he is joking around, but then in a very quick turn, he can be completely serious and mean business. But then the minute he doesn't want to be threatened anymore, he's making jokes or making comments. And I mean, the scene when Ted Danson's buried up to his neck and Leslie Nielsen is laying there next to him and making these comments and pushes the sand up in front. I mean, he is completely sadistic and torturing this guy, but he's having fun with it.
There's that sadism that's there, and you can see it in his eyes. But then when he's at his house, he's watching the two people drowning. There's a moment of regret. You know, he's drinking, and it's something that you would not get. It doesn't happen with Stephen King, right? So it's one of those things where even with all of the archness that he's doing, there's this moment where I don't know if it's regret or he's just really he's more uncomfortable than he thought watching Galen Ross drown. And I think that might be it. He's not going to go out there and save them, but it's not as fun to watch them drowning as he originally thought. He's sitting there laughing a lot. And then when it gets to a certain point, he's like, done. And then there's the thing of when he goes back on the beach and the deed's done. There's no need for humor anymore, right? And he's not really humorous. He goes out there. The bodies must have washed out. He's grabbing the cable and he finds a TV and he's like trying to figure out, it must be that I love the directorial touch there where he says, oh, these big bodies got sucked out to sea, but then there's this little pail, this pail of sand that's stuck there and did not get sucked out. So I think the range that he has really helps that story. I think all of the actors in there in the film really do that for the most part. Even Ted Danson. I mean, Ted Danson didn't have a ton to do. He had more to do than poor Galen. I was like, fuck, that's how you reward Galen. Hey, I got a part for you. What are my lines? Help!
That's because she survived Dawn of the Dead. He wanted to make sure she finally died.
I love something to tide you over. with the exception of, I think she's kind of a prop. Not only is she from his oeuvre, and yes, deserved more, I actually want to know more on her story. Or, if it was recast where it was Ted Danson was the wife and the lover was already in the sand. I think there could be a number of choices other than just having her be a prop. Although it doesn't distract me enough that I hate the episode.
The makeup effects are so fun, like where you have them, coming out and they're kind of swollen and bloated from being in the sea. And the gunshots are like the most effective moment for me, where it's like you just see that. And they don't bleed. They just kind of like bleed like seawater.
That was one of the ways that Romero got away with more violence, is by using the comic book tone for those moments. It hid the blood. So when they get a bullet head, you don't know if that's blood. You don't know if it's seawater or whatever, because of the color scheme that they were using.
Well, I feel like Romero loves like atypically covered blood, just because Dawn of the Dead, it's like that melted crayon shade of blood too. It
blows me away that Tom Savini, the master of makeup effects, was doing toilet paper, tissue paper, and he's just blow drying it. It's like, that's what I did as a kid. Oh, I'm going to be the mummy, and I'd have like roll of toilet paper on my arm.
This is a good point to maybe fold this in. This was his first quote unquote professional movie. I know he really likes Day of the Dead too, as just for being like, oh, this looks and feels like a real movie. It has real stars. It's in a major studio. It's the first time I didn't have to worry about the money. For him, this is his breakout of independent film, in the same way I'm trying to think of an equivalent, like Christopher Nolan going from Following to Batman. It's like, wow, I've got all these toys to play with, and he's never ever had that before, and only rarely had it after.
This is the one that I always hold up as, this is the one that Tom Savini should have gotten an Oscar nomination for. Tom Savini does 6 different movies and creates all of this. And I mean, I know, but like the fact that it's a horror movie, but so was American Werewolf in London. Like, why didn't that set the tone for what, The Thing came out in 82 as well. If ever there was a place for the horror movies to shine at the Oscars, it's right there. And it's a tragedy to me that I think Tom Savini is going to die without ever receiving an Oscar, when so many of his proteges have gone on, they've won awards. Hello, Tom. Everybody knows the guy's name.
He should not have won an Oscar in 1982. He should have been nominated. Rob Bottin
Rob Bottin has won an Oscar at this point. Rob Bottin has actually won an Oscar, whereas Tom Savini is going to go to his grave without one. That bums me out.
Yeah, well, I think this is a great showcase for Savini too, because a lot of times, if you're looking at a lot of the effects that he does, they're splatter effects. They are organs and stuff like that. This is Fluffy really makes this, right? Yep. Where it's, you have all of these different styles of Savini coming together. I mean, the father coming out of the ground is one. The E.G. Marshall body is really good. The drowning effects are neat. They're all different things. And he doesn't do a lot for Jordy Verrill. I don't think he did a lot of the makeup effects at all in that. Right. So he was rarely there for that. But I think when you look at Fluffy, that's just I always think about, like, there was I think it was the American Nightmare, a documentary from 2000, and they're in his home, and he has his statues, his busts of Bela Lugosi and everything, and he's showing it, and he's so proud of them because everybody just wants to talk to him about the gore, right? And so he always just wanted to do monsters. He wanted to do Frankenstein. He wanted to do Dracula. Those are the things that he loved. And I think him being able to do Fluffy was kind of this thing where he was able to go, yeah, it's not about the entrails. It's really about something that looks strange and beautiful at the same time.
Apparently the original ending of Something to Tide You Over was that Richard calls 911 when Ted Danson and Galen Ross show up in their bubbly form, and the police show up. And he goes to play the tape from the house to show them that, in fact, there were monsters in the house, because they don't believe him, and instead shows the tape of him drowning them. And then it smash cuts to his trial, then it smash cuts to him in the gas chamber hollering, "I can hold my breath for a long time."
That's kind of awesome.
Telltale Heart kind of vibe.
Yeah, that's a Roald Dahl's Tales of the Inspector kind of thing.
Yeah, because I was going to say the only thing I would miss from that, as you were describing it, was that very ending, but it sounds like they did the same stinger just in the gas chamber instead of
there's really nothing sweeter than having somebody do something atrocious and then
Right.
being
And
fed
have it
that
revisited to
same
The
them.
thing.
same,
Yeah.
because
You
he
know,
has the same look. I
justice.
mean, he's in there boasting in the sand that he can hold his breath, but then when that first wave hits and that freeze frame of his eyes getting
Yeah.
really wide,
Yeah, he
that
gets-
moment of terror.
That has one of my favorite kind of boo scares, which is when he shuts himself in the bathroom
Oh, so
and they're
good.
on the other side, and then he turns around and they're suddenly, magically inside the bathroom with him. Like
That frame crank, that because really, I mean, they turned
Yeah.
the camera, but they actually did something in post there where it's like crank, and it's really sudden, and it's a very good scare.
So let's talk about The Crate, which is I don't know if it's everybody's favorite, but it's certainly a favorite.
Anyone here's favorite, not The Crate.
It's my least favorite.
Oh, good.
Whoa.
We're gonna have to
You're
get
the
into
Hot
one.
take.
That's the most EC of
We'll,
them
we'll get
all.
into that.
I was just going to say that it has a very deliberate lead in terms of the whole story with Billy and her her husband Hal Halbrook. Adrienne Barbeau is just wonderful in this.
Oh, she's so funny in this.
She's
It's
just
ridiculous.
delightful. Aaron, what don't you like about The Crate?
It's all look
So we can all
meanly
pile
at him.
on you.
Yeah, I think mostly it's just Adrienne Barbeau is so good and I hate her. And it's just hating her and then feeling good about all the times that you see her get murdered in his imagination. You're like, yes. And that is a shitty thing to feel, in my opinion. Like, it's bad enough that you don't like her and you feel all that hate for her. So I just don't like her. I don't like feeling like I'm being justified and feeling good about her murder, and I just think it's too long. I just think it's inordinately long, and I want to get to the monster quicker than it does. I still think it's a great piece. I love it, but I love it less than the other one.
Well, and Hal
Yeah, I
Halbrook
thought-
does not have any vengeance visited upon him for the awful thing he does.
Yet, I mean, the thing escapes.
Right. You see it sneaking out at the end.
The one thing that makes it extra long is the student, but that does. I mean, I love that.
That
part.
death is great. Yeah.
Yeah, but that is the one part where you're like, if you're looking to trim 10 minutes, like the student thing is totally unnecessary.
It's my favorite for a lot of the reasons that have been listed, but monsters are my favorite type of horror. And there are monsters throughout this, but I like that it's an actual biological animal that came from the Arctic as opposed to just a ghost. I guess we get biological animals with they're creeping up on you too, but there's something I really just like about like a tangible, weird primate thing that lives under the stairs. That just presses all my buttons. And I think I probably laughed the most at The Crate too, even though it is like, when you break it down, it is kind of horrible. Like, you could divorce your wife instead of just like fantasizing about killing her. But it's, I love where he like does it and everyone at the party is like, oh yeah, like good show. That always cracks me up.
She was so shrew-like. She's off-putting at first. I will agree a bit there that it's like, whoa, how hard are you going to hit this nail?
You have to hate her that much so that you're going to be cheering with Hal Holbrook.
But you do always wonder, just get a fucking divorce.
Yeah, so
I guess I don't understand. Maybe back then, that generation, they're like, this is a big stigma to do that, particularly in a college town. I don't think anyone would object.
Right.
I will say I could see her though making up some lie about him. Like I could see her making things really hellish for him now that I'm thinking about it. Like she wouldn't go down easy kind of thing.
Is it her money?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Yeah, is it her money? I can't remember.
This is the one that I think was the centerpiece when they were coming up with the idea of doing Creepshow. I think they sat and they came up with this, and then the others came around because it has the most depth, breadth, and scope to it. I think it's also very EC. Like we like to talk about EC, about revenge and stuff, but they always set you up in the way of it's a horror movie universe. In other words, everything has to be so shitty that the answer that they have makes sense. It's like Dirty Harry. The entire city of San Francisco has to be useless. Firemen don't even know how to do their job. So that Dirty Harry has to blow that guy away. It's the only way that you'll justify him going against the rules like that is to have everything be hell. It is playing not on our sense of justice. It's playing on our sense of vengeance, right? It's the shadow part of us that horror is usually going for. And EC was a bold-faced indulgence in that. I mean, these are not politically correct stories. It lets us spew some of that venom. And I think that's the guilty pleasure that there always was with EC. I love that it becomes this really diabolical thing to get rid of a wife. There's something really EC about that. You have this mild-mannered guy, and that's a king thing, right? Carrie White is a type. The innocent gets picked on. Well, when the innocent gets power, they're far worse than anybody that was bullying them before.
That's a good point.
40 minutes, although it kind of flies for me. 40 minutes is a bit tough.
Is there any other anthology film that's so unbalanced where it feels like a film festival, but one person bogarted everything? Not only was it worth it because it was the best, but it is definitely like the whole reason to show up.
Not a feature film, but going back to like the TV series Night Gallery, you would get one episode or one vignette that was 5 minutes, and then you'd have another one that was the rest of the half hour. I don't know. Maybe there was just more in this story that they wanted to tell because they, like someone said, this was possibly the one that they built the whole thing around.
Man, that's one of the greatest horror short films, in my opinion. The Crate ever. I mean, it's just a really compelling horror short film.
You should tell Darren about Under the Table. It's just
that's also brilliant.
Yeah, it's kind of your version of The Crate, which is really good.
It is, yeah. Under the Table owes a lot to The Crate, which is a film I made, and Tom Savini and Aaron both helped us on that film. So, I like the idea of that sort of unknowable monster who's just fucking hungry or bored or whatever the deal is. I always like that. The Thing, is kind of in the ballpark there, but it's got a whole psychological counterpart to it that makes it a lot richer and deeper. But I still just like the good old monster movie. Good old monster, just gonna eat you.
What do you guys think? Do you think Fluffy is supposed to be like from a race of Yetis or something? I always and like it's funny when I was a kid, I thought Fluffy was supposed to be so big, but I'm like, no, he's almost more like a short, squat, like orangutan or something like that. I always wonder like what his background is or her background or biology.
And how did they not smell it? If it's a biological creature, it's got to be going to the bathroom in that crate.
Well, he's been in there for 100 years.
What's it eating?
How many questions?
How is it even
like
alive?
Oscar the Grouch crate too,
He's got a whole tunnel.
He was probably taller. He just from squatting for 100 years, he couldn't stand up.
He was just a little stiff.
Or maybe it was born in that crate and it's been gestating.
We're thinking way too fucking hard about this monster. It's got big teeth. Stay away. That's all we need.
It's filled with humor. It's filled with great jump scares. It's filled with several scenes of really good tension and suspense, and the score for this one in particular is unbelievable.
Well, and we haven't mentioned Fritz Weaver, but I think Fritz Weaver is kind of like he's such a great little piece of this. He's kind of the thing that helps buoy it up between Adrienne Barbeau's kind of like at 11 and Hal Halbrook at like 2 and 3, that kind of simmer. You got Fritz Weaver who's just all over the place.
Yeah, he plays a lot of big and small moments there perfectly. I always liked him as a character actor. I liked him in, was it The Embryo or Demon Seed? I can't remember.
Demon Seed.
Yeah.
I liked him in Demon Seed, and I liked him in Martian Chronicles, even though flawed as it is. I don't like Fritz a lot. I think he's very cool.
That line when he's getting hysterical when he said Charlie wanted to measure the bite marks, and then I bet he did.
Our last one is They're Creeping Up on You, which is the cockroach episode. Kind of what it is. Like, it's just the cockroach episode.
I always dissed the last episode. Not because I thought it was bad. I really hate bugs. So it was never really my thing. But I have to say, when I saw it, it felt like a really tight experimental film. It really felt so foreign from the 4 that came before it, even though it had a lot of the same, artifacts within it. The sound design was totally different. The score was very atonal. The performance and the wide angle lenses and the guy outside the door, it felt super freaking arty compared to the rest. And I almost wish I had more. I mean, I guess maybe the opening part of Season of the Witch, I don't have too much George Romero art nerd stuff to love. And that's definitely one of them.
I like the fact that Romero does try and do something different directorially for each one of the segments as well. Like you said about the Jordy Verrill, like you've got those canted angles. Here we've got like sterile white design.
It also makes the cockroaches stand out more too.
Yeah, let's talk about the cockroaches.
Well, first, let's talk about Upston Pratt, who I consider a personal hero. Because there is no bigger asshole on this planet. Unfeeling, just, oh my God, is he a bastard? And he is so funny.
Yeah.
Everybody that he talks to he doesn't give a shit about. He just treats them like shit. Even Mrs. Castlemeyer, the one her husband shoots himself, and he's like, "Yeah, I heard he went out with a bang." I mean, he just is such a prick. So again, it's fitting for his end, but every moment he's on screen, I think it's entertaining as hell.
Well, and I feel like this is a Tarantino moment where Romero is bringing in somebody like E.G. Marshall that might not be as well known to that generation. Like
Yeah.
I knew him as a radio guy. Like he was hosting like the Mystery Theater. And I was like, oh, that's what E.G. Marshall looks like.
12 Angry Men.
Mhm.
Right. But that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like it was all of his heyday was, quite a while back. And so to bring him forward and let him have, basically it's a one-person show.
I feel like I'd only seen him in Christmas Vacation, I think, before that. But I don't know if it came out before that, but I'd seen that before Creepshow. So, and he's kind of playing a similar type of guy. I mean, he's not as awful in Christmas Vacation, but just that like, grumpy old dude, pretty much. Has he ever given an interview just like, I don't know, I'd love to hear how he felt about acting with a bunch of bugs or anything, like if he was down for it or if he was just there for the paycheck or anything like that.
Allegedly, he was a total sport about it,
Cool.
whereas like John Amplis in the first part, Father's Day, wouldn't let them put maggots on him and everything. They had to have a girl from the crew jump in there. They said that E.G. Marshall allowed them to be on him all over. The thing that wasn't in this version, which was in the comic book version, which I thought was really cool, and I probably just could not do it, is that Bernie Wrightson drew the cockroaches in the shadows all the time.
Yeah.
So he'd been talking and stuff, and the cockroaches would be shifted in one side. So you were always feeling this, like, oh my God, they're going to jump at any moment. So there's like this weird tension in every one of the frames. And I really like what was mentioned before, the idea that it feels experimental. I love the idea that you never really see the face of the doorman, right? But you see this big smiling teeth and then a big eye on the other side. And it's such a weird ass fucking thing to do, but it's fun. You could tell that made Romero laugh. Like, what are we going to do with this fucking thing? I've got a door. I've got an eyepiece. What the shit? What else do I got? This will be funny. And it really says a bit about how exaggerated their conversation has to be for the guy behind the door to tolerate this fucker, and for E.G. Marshall to bequeath a conversation from himself to this person.
There's not much diversity in the film. There's not much diversity in this podcast. But
there is zero diversity in this podcast.
But
Apologies.
I do like the performance, the guy behind the door. And I'm sorry, I'm forgetting his name, but he's also in Dawn of the Dead.
Right.
As the interviewer in the beginning, he's fun as hell there too. But he's so good. He's like a Pittsburgh theater actor.
David Early.
David Early. Thank you. Yeah. Actually, let's give a big shout out to all the actors because they got bugs, they got freaking water, they got to do all these things and on a low budget rapidly and just be a part of a giant piece of the puzzle. No one's really got a starring role. I mean, good God. I mean, to pull that off is amazing. And
that is kind of the feel of it, right? Is that everybody is game. Everybody is down to do this. And because they're all kind of short subjects, I'm guessing everybody only shot for like a week or two. And then they were moving on to the next thing.
Danson, having that whole underwater sequence where they have to have the regulator come in and that Savini's off to the side, even though they have all these things, he makes a point of saying, I had a sledgehammer. I was going to Houdini the motherfucker.
Get him out of there. So let's talk about the score really quick.
It's one of my favorite all-time. I mean, same with the movie. I love the score. I think it encapsulates what the film is perfectly.
Yeah, I freaking love this score. And you know what's funny is it's just two instruments. It's a piano and a Prophet 5 synthesizer, and then some library music and some other things to supplement. But and some voices in the theme song. But that Prophet synthesizer sounds like an old pipe organ sometimes. Just what he's playing, even though it's a modern analog synth take on it from 1982. But it feels like so Phantom of the Opera at points, and I just love the daringness of it. And that theme song is so good. I cannot believe Creepshow 2 and the series, they don't use that. What was the problem? It is the perfect theme song in the same way maybe Halloween was a perfect theme song, or The Exorcist or Phantasm.
I just got to see John Harrison. I was at Stoker Con, which is in Pittsburgh. So they had a whole thing about being around Romero, and they had a bunch of people who worked with Romero to talk about him. And Harrison was essentially saying, you know, I'm so proud of this soundtrack because it was just kind of asked of me. You know, it talks about like Michael Gornick didn't start as a cinematographer until Martin. You know, halfway through Martin, Romero goes, I'm fucking tired carrying this camera. You want to do this? And Gornick's like, yeah, I did this in the Air Force. And Harrison, same thing. You know, he wasn't really known for scores. And it's like, I need someone to do this. We don't have a lot of money. He's like, well, I can play the piano and I can do this thing. And he came up with something rudimentary, and then they played with that. And so there's this wonderful thing that Romero did often, which is, you know, we throw in the kitchen sink at things. Dude, you want to do something? Yes, I would love to do it. And somebody will stand up and do it. I mean, when I'm writing, that's one of the things that I put on is the Creepshow, because there's just this wonderful feel.
It's a great to write to. Yes, I will agree. Each of those sections gives its own themes and its own style, even though they're using the same instrumentation. And but like, I don't think any of his music's in episode 2 aside from the bookends, because that's all library. But generally, you know, they really made, as with the sound design, mistakenly on Father's Day, but they really tried to make the score different in each one, and then just have the theme songs be really strong at the beginning and end. It's a great choice. And John Harrison did sign my LP, the original one I bought when I was 10 years old. Nice. I did run into John Harrison in Chicago, and he signed it, and he was very surprised that it was, you know, dented in the original. He's like, you want me to sign this? It's kind of beat up. I said, well, I fucking played it a lot. But yeah, it's an amazingly good score. And he's done, you know, I was really anti-Day of the Dead score when it came out because I thought it was so Miami Vice, but now I love that score too. I think that score is terrific.
So let's talk a little bit about this new release, because it's a UHD release, and it had a 2018 Blu-ray release, which had like a little slip cover, had, you know, Blu-ray had a little, you know, like tons of liner notes, which we don't get with the new 4K.
Right.
We miss out on that. All of the extras, and there are tons of extras. We have, you know, 3 commentaries plus another commentary that's just made up of archival interviews that Michael Felsher did. We have tons of featurettes. You know, like we talked to Michael Gornick. We talked to the costume designer, the animator, Rick Catazzoni. Like, we have a horror hallowed grounds. It's an amazing release. And then we get a new release that is UHD. And I think this is the debate I want to, you know, have, is like, is it worth upgrading for? And I don't know who all has the new UHD and it has the capacity in which to enjoy it. But it just seems like we're getting more and more of these releases that are UHD, but that's it. Like, it's the same package that you already own, but then you get a UHD as well.
I have a UHD TV and player and everything, and Creepshow is in my top 10. I will wait till this goes on sale for like half price, because I'm not rebuying that whole damn thing
right
just for the UHD print. I have all the other stuff on the past release. I'm fine with that for the time being. I'm not paying $40 or $50 or whatever it is just to have that one disc.
I got the Martin, the Second Sight one, and a couple other things where you have the UHD, and then it also comes with a Blu-ray. And the reason for that is that the UHD doesn't have a lot of room for features. It's such a huge bandwidth of information that the UHD takes up pretty much the entire disc, and then the extras and the outside of commentaries are on the Blu-ray disc. Right. And normally they give you a soundtrack as well, just to, you know, fuck it, we'll give them a soundtrack too. So I was disappointed when I saw that they're just giving the UHD, because I was like, we don't have room for, you know, other things. It's just literally getting me that image. And for some things, I think it's probably worth it, but I didn't do it out of spite because I was like, right, I got all this great stuff. And you know what? Blu-ray is pretty damn good for now. I'm the guy that bought every version of John Carpenter's The Thing since VHS, including the Laserdisc and stuff. So I bought the movie like 8 times.
So is there anybody here on the panel who's kind of like a UHD advocate, you know, who's like, yes, it's worth the upgrade for me?
You know, I want to go against that. I'm sort of, I show too much. Like, I was watching an 8K thing at a TV store thinking of upgrading, and they were showing The Dark Knight. I'm like, I can see every phony stitch in that costume. But I actually kept my Phase 4, my bootleg of Phase 4, because it was dirtier looking than the Blu-ray. Some movies, and maybe this is one of them, you don't need that detail. And I hate to, like, I don't know if you're being sponsored by the 8K thing. It's not universal. It's just not like, oh, I hate 8K or something like that. I was totally buy Dawn of the Dead upgraded just to see what's going on and feel like you're more immersed. If so, I've seen the 3D Dawn of the Dead and I friggin' loved it.
Creepshow is a gorgeous movie. And, you know, if you could give me more colors and things like that, then, you know, why not?
4K is getting very close. Now, it's not a one-to-one relationship. So I teach film and video production, right? So I do the under the hood stuff. So the technology of it is something that I'm interested in. And it's not a one-to-one relationship, but 35 millimeter film, if you kind of count out the halide crystals and stuff in it, it approaches 5K resolution. So fundamentally, 4K is probably the closest we're ever going to get in a major consumer release of what a 35 millimeter film is going to look like approximately. So once we get up to 8K, I think you're exactly right, Darren. That's when we get into the land of, you know, they've had to shoot for it. They had to produce a new screen for it. But if we, you know, and I think a lot of people always get hung up on seeing it the way that it was originally intended. 99% of the films, even still, that were ever created were created on 35 millimeter or 16 millimeter film. So I think that if we want to see it the way that it looked whenever it was created, 4K gives us that opportunity. Now, to everybody else's point, I'm not an advocate for it unless they include special features or something that make it spicy. I know I'm working on commentaries right now for, I pointed at my whiteboard that you can't see. That's good TV. For 4 releases that have Blu-rays out already that are great Blu-ray releases, and they're putting out 4Ks. And I know the company is dedicated to putting out some more content that's not already there. So I'm not sure that is the model going forward, that the Creepshow model where they're just like, here it is, you get it in 4K, and that's the entirety of it. I think other companies are going to be hopefully smarter.
Yeah, I've seen a few from Arrow. The UHD is the big deal. Like that's the selling point, is that, and now
Synapse.
it's in UHD.
Yeah, Synapse stuff is always known for its quality of look, right? So Synapse is always going to try and lead on that, whereas, you know, Severin and others, it's the special features that really knock it out of the park as well as the look. But, you know, it's all contextual. I mean, it's not a horror film, but I got The Deer Hunter on UHD, and the opening sequence of that inside of the refinery is mind-blowing. I like sit there and turn off all the fucking lights in the house and just sit there and watch the fucking lava of steel going around. But that's a big difference from Last House on Dead End Street and a fucking fake leg getting sawed, right? And that's where lovers of cinema, not just scientists or not just marketers, people who love movies have to take a look at that and say, you know what? In this case, less is more.
Fulci Zombie, when that was on the Japanese Laserdisc, and the zombie bites the girl
Shark.
in the throat. Well, no, I mean, you're like, oh my God, he actually just ripped her throat out. You watch that on Blu-ray, and you could see her skin tone changes right underneath her jawline to her neck. And just recently, I watched the 4K of Bubba Hotep, and I love that movie. And I always thought Bruce Campbell and the makeup, he was awesome. Watching that in 4K, you're sitting there looking at him going, that looks like a dime store makeup job, because you can, to Darren's part, you can see every makeup part and it looks terrible. I never noticed that before in all the other versions. But when you get to be that clear and that sharp, some things are going to fall apart, especially when you're talking about makeup effects in horror films.
Well, what we're talking about here is kind of a post-production where the director, you know, does not have a say in how this actually looks before it's presented to an audience. To the idea of like, you're getting too much. Well, then the director would do something. You know, he would provide some kind of optical effect to cover the seams, and so that it looks okay. But this idea of they're presenting it in, you know, in its original form, it's like, no, you're not. You're presenting it in its cleanest form, which is not the same thing as artistic, you know, representation. Like there aren't people in the room saying, hang on, I can see that looks horrible. Let's either cut that out or cut around it or whatever, like something that a director and editor would do.
Every
Right.
director needs a Leon Vitali to survive them, and like
Right.
right.
I was just going to bring that up. I was like, the one guy that could probably survive 20K is Kubrick.
Yeah,
You know? It's
yeah.
like everything's
I love
real.
Kubrick. He's made, in my mind, the only movie that is completely flawless technically, but also I like it narratively. 2001, except in there is one shot where somebody's got their hands crossed and it cuts back and they don't have their hands crossed, and then it cuts back and they got their hands crossed, and I'm still like, how did he not catch this?
You know, that's what killed him, right? That killed him.
that shot.
Yeah. It's like, he saw it later. I don't know, later. It's like, fuck, there goes my entire career.
I just think that sometimes the clarity takes away some of the magic.
Yeah.
And it goes back to a friend of mine who is a huge Harryhausen fan. When they started releasing his stuff on Laserdisc, where you could go frame by frame, and he would get all excited because he could find the wires or the pegs that you don't see when you're watching the film. And
Right.
even Harryhausen made the point, stop doing this shit. You're seeing the tricks. You're seeing behind the curtain. You shouldn't see that.
I hate more when they erase the wires, right? When they sit there and go back, and the director says, well, you know what? I didn't have enough money last time. And now, like Stephen King rewriting The Stand, so it's 8 times longer. You know, all of that stuff bothers me. I like the idea that at some art's never done until you give it to the audience. And then boom, at that point.
It bothers me unless it is me, because I've remixed many songs and re-released them.
There we go. There we go. I got kicked right in the face on that one. Aaron has mentioned this, and I've become like this crazy evangelist advocate for it. I think that there should be a way we treasure, like Scorsese is preserving film. I think we need to preserve the extras. I think we need to preserve the audio commentaries. We need to preserve these interviews that seem like they're pointless. I always go back to the idea of movie posters, where movie posters didn't even have people sign them because they were just fucking errata that was laying around. It means nothing to the marketers. It's just filler for so many people. There are all these different groups that go out and, you know, make these shorts for DVDs. They should be kept, because these people aren't going to be around forever. I mean, I'm watching some old extras now, and half the people are gone. And think about if you had Bela Lugosi talking and Boris Karloff just sitting around doing an audio commentary. We'd be living for that. And so much of what I love about cinema, once I had the reason I got a Laserdisc player was because of commentaries. And I just sat there and I listened to Carpenter, and Carpenter was like a film school. He told you where all the mistakes were. He had no guile in what he was doing. And that was so great. And Bad Day at Black Rock. Oh my God. John Sturgis will tell you so much about filmmaking in that one moment. I think it's precious stuff.
There have been times for research purposes. Yeah. I'll be like, oh yeah, I remember what so-and-so said on that commentary, but I want to verify it. And it's weird to me that you usually can't stream a commentary like anywhere.
You're right, Dan, that like the idea of we should make these available as part of the movie. Like if you like the movie, you should be able to dig deeper. Like when we finish watching a movie, my wife is always like, are there any special features?
Right.
You know, if she likes the movie, because she wants to know more about it. She doesn't want to have to just immediately dive into Wikipedia or whatever. Like it should be created by the folks who are presenting the movie to you.
I talk to a lot of film fans, people who are super into film, who don't ever really watch the special features. And I find that so bizarre. So I think that we're a rare crowd. But I will say this, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, to what Scott said, that people should preserve it. And I'd go a step further, not just the special features as they are. See, I edit special features. I'm working on one right now. And what I usually get is an hour-long interview that I am lucky to stretch out to 20, 25 minutes. So just because of the awkward way that people phrase things, I'm working on a piece right now about a pretty well-known spaghetti Western star from that era, from the 60s. And I'm going to cut out a 2 or 3 minute section where he talks about his relationship with George Eastman, just because it screws up the flow, right? But that is important stuff to know, to have his conversation about his relationship with this other really well-known actor, even if all he really says is he's the biggest damn Italian I ever saw in my life, you know. But I think that kind of thing matters for those of us who care. And I think that these are the kinds of things that are going to be important to historians in the future. So I think that we absolutely have to preserve it. And I'm super evangelical about getting people those to come back around. to ask people, why don't you watch these things? You love films. And they're like, I just never think of it. And I'm like, write yourself a note, try to think of it, because it's so useful in opening up your understanding of these movies.
Yeah. And archives. I think archives are so important. Like, I just was in Pittsburgh and I went again to the George Romero archives. I've been there twice now. And there, I think every film student in Pittsburgh should have to go there, because there's 100 boxes of stuff that Romero did. And there's only 24 movies tops, with the commercials and everything that he put together. But there are unopened scripts. There are envelopes that he mailed to himself. There is a temple to failure. The most successful, The Godfather, right? The Godfather of the zombie, the guy who's one of the pantheon. Most of his stuff failed. Most of his ideas were spitballed, but it's so precious. And it's not like it's going to make money. They don't have that archive at Pitt to make money. They have that there for the sake of the art, right? The archive. And that's what I think about. Like, I don't care if everybody watches the commentaries. I want to watch the commentaries. Right. And it should be available for those that want that historical art form. And I think that, you're right about the things that get cut out, because there are just so many pieces. Like, I have multiple versions of The Thing, because there are certain audio commentaries that are no longer available. Right. They didn't make it past whatever the vault was that needed to be done. There's a wild bunch I wish I never gave away, the Laserdiscs, that had a documentary that was narrated by Peckinpah's daughter. I've never been able to find it again. And there was an A&E thing with Dennis Hopper that's gone. Can't find it anywhere, not even on like YouTube, but bootlegged.
Well, and we talked a little bit about this on the Robert Englund episode, the idea that like it was a little over 2 hours. And it's kind of like, is that too long of a documentary? And it's like, well, the people who are interested in Robert Englund, they want to be 8 hours long.
People are more worried about getting a new limited edition slipcover than any extras.
For me, Creepshow, we're talking about special features and all that. So horror fans, I think, more than almost any other community, are a community of people who become makers at a much higher rate. The fans become makers more than I've ever seen in any other genre. Science fiction, certainly it's close, but they become makers of costumes more than they become makers of the kinds of things they want to consume at quite the same rate. And I think part of it is sort of the phenomenology of horror. You got to keep your eyes on it, but it's grossing you out or it's scaring you, and you're looking for ways to get around those emotions. So you're like, well, what is the lighting doing? But for me, Creepshow was the movie I think that I first was like, oh, lighting affects my emotion, and the way this thing is edited changes how I feel about it. And I think the reason the Jordy Verrill piece is so impactful to me is that it is so grim. I mean, if you extrapolate what happens at the end of that one, that what's going to happen is the earth is going to be consumed. We're all headed for that fate, right? That's what's ultimately going to befall everyone. And yet it's the funniest one of the bunch. So it taught me about tone. So to me, I think this is a film that taught a lot of young horror fans about how cinema works and got them to peer under the cover for the first time. And it certainly did for me.
I know we knocked a little bit hard on the UHD release. There are so many great supplements on it. So if you haven't picked it up already, it is a great release. There's so much information. I think there's enough information that any Creepshow fan is going to feel like, this movie that I've known and loved for years and years, I know it better now. And I think to your point, Aaron, like that's the kind of thing that inspires, being able to see how these things were made and to be like, I could maybe do that too.
I was going to say, my favorite special feature on that UHD was just Tom Savini's, behind the scenes footage, which doesn't even have narration or any kind of structure to it. You're just watching them try to get the creep to work, right? And seeing them fail at it and watching them try to put maggots on the corpse's face. And I got such a kick out of that. And also going back to what y'all were saying about, it's very rare that we actually see a movie how it was intended to be captured, because it's just grainy old home footage that almost feels like the original version of the movie.
That was Greg Nicotero.
That's Nicotero filming that?
Yeah, he was. I mean, that was before he even got working with Savini, but he was on set.
Oh, that's cool.
Was just walking around with the video camera. Savini just told him, keep filming everything.
It almost looked like just like a high-8 camera or something like that. Like nothing crazy. Oh, that's so cool that it was Nicotero.
Yeah. I like Terror in Three Rivers. When they start talking about George, it's no longer an interview. And that's what really made me happy when when Felsher says something like, "I can't see him gone," and Savini goes, "He's not.
Yeah.
You know, I don't see him as gone." And Savini saying, "Yeah, I was an asshole when you first met me. I'm changing." And there's just something really personable about that didn't feel like they were repeating the same thing they've talked about a lot. And I think it was because Felsher could not hold the reins with those guys. They were just having fun.
Well, and it's a great round table. It's John Amplis, Tom Atkins, Marty Schiff, and Tom Savini and Michael Felsher moderating. And Michael Felsher, you know, shout out to him because he was kind of instrumental in most of these. And he also has that documentary about Creepshow.
Just Desserts, yeah.
Yeah, I want to have Just Desserts included. They could have put that in this UHD release, and I've been like, okay, now you're talking.
Yeah, absolutely. Hail, Red Shirt.
Well, thank you all so much. We have gabbled on very extensively, and it's been such a pleasure because of the fact that it's 6 movies. You know, there's a lot to talk about.
It's well worth it. I mean, I'm so glad I was on this because this is a favorite.
So really quickly, just go around as we're saying our goodbyes. What is your favorite segment?
The crate.
I don't have one. I like 3 of them a lot.
The crate.
The crate.
It's the crate, but over time, I think they're creeping up on you, and something tied you over are getting up there.
Yeah.
So I just wish there was one segment as good as any of them in Creepshow 2.
Another episode. My favorite is Something to Tide You Over. Like it is grown. I think the crate was probably my favorite initially, but Something to Tide You Over is just really, there's something about it that speaks to an older version of me. Thank you all so much. We will be getting the gang back together again. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.